Well, Alejandro, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us at our earlier program. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions this afternoon. First of all, the coronavirus pandemic is already affecting the global economy in a very significant way. How will the virus affect the economies in Latin America? And which countries or group of countries are the most susceptible to the impact of the virus?
Okay, so first of all, given that this is a public health issue, obviously the most vulnerable countries will be those that have weaker health systems to deal with the human and the health aspect of the pandemic. As you said, this started several months ago, and I think economists were thinking on how this was going to affect Latin America basically through spillovers from other countries. And what has happened is that it has directly affected Latin America. Latin America is at the initial stages of the pandemic, but obviously it's going to go through the phases that we have seen in other parts of the world. So every country will be severely affected by the important health policy measures that will be needed to be put in place to contain the pandemic. And therefore, that will drive to a very synchronized regional recession. On top of that, we will have the spillovers coming from the rest of the world. So we will have, the significant recession that Latin America trading partners are having, affecting exports, the declining commodity prices affecting commodity exporters, the decline in tourism affecting tourist destinations, and in that sense, the Caribbean being significantly dependent on tourism will be severely affected. We will have those countries in Central America and Mexico that depend on remittances from the U.S. also feeling this pain. So, and obviously Latin America being a region that it's also dependent on foreign capital flows. Now that we have seen the largest decline in portfolio flows to the region in recent history, obviously Latin America being significantly affected by the negative capital account shock. So I think no country will be spared. Different countries will be shocked by different spillovers. And the most important thing is all of them will have to take the necessary measures to contain the pandemic and to minimize the effect on the health of each population. No?
Thank you very much. And how does the IMF view the policy response in the region so far? Have governments in the region done enough in terms of health and economic policies? What else should they be doing at this point?
Look, I think countries are building their policy response. Countries are learning from what was done in the rest of the world. And I think at different speeds are coming to the same conclusions that led different countries to approach this by significantly locking down people in their homes, going to this new term that we learned of social distancing, closing schools, closing the borders, etc., to try to significantly reduce the speed of contagion so the health systems can actually accommodate the significant increase in demand for health services that this is generating. And then countries are moving in a more difficult scenario in designing their policy, the economic policy response. Advanced economies have the luxury of having very ample fiscal space. So they can launch very aggressive fiscal programs to try to help all of those affected, households, firms, etc. In Latin America, the fiscal situation is less comfortable. Now, government debt cost is going up, availability of financing is drying up, and therefore they have to be much more careful in how they deploy support for households, support for firms to be able to weather this pandemic. I think governments are also designing this policy as we speak. I think all of them are trying to protect the most vulnerable sectors of society, and foremost, they're trying to give their health systems as much as resources as needed. But also after that, they have to think how they support the households and how they support the firms that are being affected without significantly weakening their fiscal position, because this will be counterproductive. So I think the best recipe for that is to send very strong signals that in the future, countries will be as responsible as they have been in the past. But in the present, it's time to spend more on people, spend more on firms, and spend more on primarily on health infrastructure. So the most you can do to anchor the future, the more space you will have in the present. And we're seeing countries deploying that. And lastly, I mean, an important issue in Latin America that also complicates these mechanisms to support firms and households is the level of informality in the economies. So when we have a high degree of formality, the government has a financial relationship with every household, with every firm. So through that financial relationship, it's easier now to deploy resources in the other direction. Instead of the government receiving resources from firms and individuals, now paying back. However, when you don't have that relationship, it's harder to target those households and those firms, and governments are trying to overcome that challenge, to basically support also the informal population that in many cases it has a significant degree of the underprivileged sectors of society.
I would just add, Alejandro, that I think, this is you're going to see the digital side of the economy, explode, e-commerce, e-finance, et cetera, because of that relationship that you just talked about. But also, I think it's going to be very important for governments to think about small and medium-sized companies and just not the larger companies.
No, exactly. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think governments in Latin America, through their development banks, through the work with the banking system, and through the work through the non-bank financial institutions that give microcredit, et cetera, to really deploy as much support as they can to these firms. Actually, I mean, when you look at the healthy, strong, big corporates in Latin America, I mean, they might need to design an important policy response together with the government. But some of them have better financing conditions than even the governments. So in that sense, I mean, they're a better place to weather these storms than the government, some of them. They will need the design of the support together with the government, but obviously they're in a much better position than smaller firms that have seen their incomes collapse and they don't have any source of financing.
Thank you. So what role can the IMF play in all of this?
Look, the IMF is playing, obviously, its role of policy advisor. And the first quick thing that we did is put together a toolkit for countries to follow what other countries are doing. That's up in the web, and countries can look at that. And we are in dialogue with all the governments on how to design these different policy responses. But I mean, obviously, more importantly, in this environment in which the need for financing has increased and the availability of financing has dried up for many of these countries, the IMF, we are working very quickly to deploy our rapid financing instrument to our members. We have had more than 80 requests, and what we are trying to do in the next few weeks is to respond to these requests as fast as possible, and then to continue to deploy our traditional windows, like the flexible credit line, standby agreements, and other programs to support these countries. And we're working with our membership to think what else might be needed, is something else needed, and therefore brainstorming with the membership to be able to build the most comprehensive and effective response to emerging markets and low-income economies that are the ones that at the end will suffer the most. And for that, I think it's important also to say that, I mean, member economies have agreed to fund our a facility that we have to provide support to cover debt service for the lower income countries, debt service to the IMF. That facility has been built up. The IMF and the World Bank have also called for debt support for the low income countries during this pandemic coming from bilateral lending creditors. And we're working with the membership to see what the emerging markets and low-income countries will be in need of and trying to devise responses for those needs.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for your comments, and good luck. I don't know when you're going to sleep.
Thanks, Susan. And we will continue to be in touch to understand what, I mean, your members, the members of the council in the ground are doing, feeling, and how we can join forces in these very, very difficult times for the region.
We look forward to it. Thank you very much and good luck.